The head waiter greeted them with a polite smile. Their table was set. The champagne was chilled and food was served. For the first time in months, Wallace and Eleanor Ford felt at peace. Until a silver-haired man in a $1,000 suit whispered across the room. Then, a manager approached their table with a tight smile and a practice line. "I'm sorry, but you'll need to leave." What began as a quiet anniversary dinner in the city's most exclusive restaurant suddenly turned into something else. A test of dignity, a memory, a justice. They thought they were just an elderly couple. They had no idea who they had just humiliated. Just before we begin, what time of day do you usually settle in for a good story? Morning coffee, lunch break, or late night unwind? Drop it in the comments. Trust me, this one's powerful. Be sure to hit that subscribe button. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the windows of Wallace and Eleanor Ford's modest yet elegant home. Wallace, 78, adjusted his bow tie in the bedroom mirror, his fingers moving with the practiced precision of a man who had dressed for important occasions his entire life. 50 years, he said softly, meeting Eleanor's eyes in the reflection. Sometimes it feels like yesterday we were marching in Montgomery. Eleanor, 76, smiled as she fastened a simple pearl necklace around her neck. And sometimes it feels like several lifetimes ago. She stepped beside him, smoothing down his lapel with hands that had once drafted landmark legal briefs and guided countless students through constitutional law. "The Cartwright Club," Wallace mused. "Never thought I'd see the day we'd be celebrating our anniversary there." "Times change," Eleanor replied, though her tone carried a note of caution. "At least that's what we're supposed to believe." Their granddaughter Maya had arranged everything. The Cartwright Club was the most exclusive restaurant in the city, operating on a membership basis that had only recently, within the last decade, begun accepting members of color. Maya had connections through her law firm and had secured them a special anniversary dinner reservation. "Maya says their chef trained in Paris," Eleanor said, applying a touch of lipstick. "And the private dining room overlooks the river." Wallace nodded, but a familiar tension tightened his shoulders. Throughout his career as a federal judge, he had grown accustomed to being the only black face in exclusive spaces. Even now, years into retirement, he couldn't fully shed the vigilance that had become second nature. "It's our night," Eleanor reminded him, reading his thoughts as she had for half a century. "We've earned this." The drive to the restaurant was pleasant, the early evening sky painted in shades of orange and purple. They reminisced about their wedding day, a simple ceremony during turbulent times. Both had been deeply involved in the civil rights movement. Both had chosen careers in law to fight injustice from within the system. The Cartwright Club stood imposing against the darkening sky, its red brick exterior and columns speaking of old money and tradition. A valet took their car, and Wallace offered Eleanor his arm as they walked up the steps. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over polished wood and plush carpets. A young host greeted them with professional courtesy. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," Wallace replied. "Ford. 4-2 at 7 o'clock. The host scanned his list, a slight frown crossing his face before he composed himself. "Ah, yes. Through our special events program. Please follow me." As they moved through the main dining room, Wallace felt eyes tracking their progress. Most diners quickly looked away when he met their gaze, returning to their conversations and expensive meals. It was nothing new. The quick glances, the momentary calculations, the subtle registering of difference. Their table was beautiful, set with fine china and silver, fresh flowers arranged in a low centerpiece that allowed conversation to flow easily. Through the windows, city lights twinkled along the river. "Your server will be with you shortly," the host said, pulling out Eleanor's chair. Eleanor reached across the table to take Wallace's hand once they were settled. "Happy anniversary, my love." 50 years of standing together, Wallace replied, his deep voice warm with feeling. "There's no one else I'd rather have beside me." Their server, a young woman named Melissa, arrived with a bottle of champagne. "Compliments of your granddaughter," she explained, expertly popping the cork. She wanted to make sure your celebration began properly. As they sipped the crisp champagne, Wallace felt himself relaxing. The menu offered sophisticated takes on classic dishes, and they ordered with the confidence of people who had dined in fine establishments around the world during Wallace's judicial career. Across the room, a silver-haired white man in an impeccable suit kept glancing their way. He leaned to speak to his dinner companion, then signaled for the manager. Wallace noticed but said nothing, choosing instead to focus on Eleanor as she described the art exhibition they planned to visit the following weekend. Daniel Hoffman, the restaurant manager, listened intently as Charles Whitfield spoke in low, urgent tones. Whitfield was not only a founding member of the Cartwright Club, but also chairman of the board that governed the city's arts endowment. His family name adorned the wing of the local hospital. "There must be some mistake," Whitfield was saying. "The private dining membership has clear protocols. I don't recall their application being presented to the committee." Daniel nodded deferentially. "Let me look into this immediately, Mr. Whitfield." As their appetizers arrived, Wallace saw the manager approaching their table, his face a careful mask of professional concern. 50 years of reading courtrooms had taught Wallace to recognize when trouble was coming. He gently squeezed Eleanor's hand, a silent signal developed over decades of partnership. Whatever was about to happen, they would face it together, just as they always had. "Excuse me, Mr. and Mrs. Ford." Daniel Hoffman stood at their table, his posture stiff and formal. "I hope you're enjoying your evening so far." "We are," Wallace replied evenly, noting how the manager's eyes never quite met his. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding regarding your reservation." Daniel lowered his voice, though not enough to prevent nearby diners from overhearing. "The Cartwright Club operates on a membership basis for our main dining service." Eleanor set down her fork. "Our granddaughter arranged this dinner through her law firm. We have a confirmation." "Yes, well." Daniel cleared his throat. "While we do occasionally partner with certain organizations for special events, those are typically held in our separate banquet facilities. This particular dining room is reserved for members and their registered guests." A heavy silence fell over the table. Wallace felt a familiar heat rising in his chest, not the quick flare of surprise, but the slow burn of recognition. This was an old dance, the steps barely changed since the lunch counters of the 1960s. "Our granddaughter made these arrangements weeks ago," Wallace said calmly. "No one mentioned any membership requirements." Daniel's smile tightened. "It appears someone in our events department made an error. I do apologize for the confusion, but we'll need to adhere to our policies." At a nearby table, a young couple pretended not to listen, their discomfort evident in their suddenly intense focus on their meals. Across the room, Charles Whitfield watched with thinly veiled satisfaction. Eleanor straightened in her chair, her dignity a palpable force. "And what exactly are those policies, Mr. Hoffman?" "The Cartwright Club maintains certain standards. Our membership committee carefully reviews all applicants to ensure they align with our establishment values and traditions." "I see," Wallace said quietly. "And what values might those be?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "I'm simply enforcing our long-standing rules. Perhaps your granddaughter misunderstood the nature of our reservation system." Wallace looked at Eleanor, a lifetime of silent communication passing between them. They had been here before. Different decade, different setting, same underlying message. "You don't belong here." "We've barely touched our meal," Eleanor noted. "We'd be happy to have it packaged for you to take home," Daniel offered, his relief evident. "Of course, there will be no charge for what you've consumed." Wallace slowly folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate. "That won't be necessary." Around them, conversations had quieted. The weight of attention pressed down, unwanted and familiar. Throughout his career, Wallace had maintained his composure in far more hostile environments. He had argued before the Supreme Court, faced down threats during desegregation cases, and never lost his measured dignity. "May I see your membership guidelines?" Wallace asked. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "Pardon? Your membership guidelines?" "The written policies you're currently enforcing." Those are internal documents," Daniel stammered. "I see." Wallace stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Then we'll remove ourselves from your establishment." Eleanor rose beside him, her spine straight as a blade. "Our granddaughter will be disappointed to learn of this misunderstanding." As they gathered their belongings, a few diners looked away in embarrassment. Others watched with uncomfortable fascination. Charles Whitfield sipped his wine, satisfied that order had been restored. In the parking lot, the night air felt suddenly cold. The valet brought their car, his young face troubled as he handed Wallace the keys. "I'm sorry about that, sir," he said quietly. "That wasn't right." Wallace nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the young man's small act of decency. Once inside the car, Eleanor let out a long breath. 50 years, she said, her voice finally revealing a tremor of anger. 50 years, and some things haven't changed at all. Wallace started the engine, but didn't immediately put the car in drive. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles whitening slightly. "We could let it go," he said, though they both knew he was simply voicing the thought to dismiss it. "We've seen worse. We've fought bigger battles." Eleanor turned to look at him, the streetlights illuminating her face. Is that what Judge Wallace Ford would tell the young attorneys he mentored? To let injustice slide because they've seen worse. A small smile touched Wallace's lips. "You know it isn't." "Then let's go home and call Maya," Eleanor said. She should know what happened at her grandfather's anniversary dinner. As they drove away from the Cartwright Club, Wallace's mind drifted back to a courtroom in 1968 when a young lawyer had stood before him arguing passionately that the law must be more than words on paper, that it must be a living force for equality. That young lawyer had been him, decades before he would ascend to the federal bench himself. Some battles, he reflected, you fought not for yourself, but for those who would come after you. Behind them, the Cartwright Club continued its evening service, the brief disruption already fading from the patrons' minds. But for Daniel Hoffman, a seed of unease had been planted. Something in the dignified couple's demeanor suggested this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Maya Stevens nearly dropped her phone when she heard what happened. They did what? Her voice rose sharply, drawing glances from colleagues still working late at her law firm. Wallace held the phone slightly away from his ear. "It's not the first time someone's asked us to leave an establishment, sweetheart. This isn't 1965, Grandpa." And the Cartwright, I specifically confirmed everything with their events coordinator. Twice. Maya's outrage vibrated through the connection. Thomas Crawford himself approved the reservation as a personal favor. Eleanor, sitting beside Wallace on their living room sofa, leaned closer to the speaker. "Who is Thomas Crawford?" "The owner of the restaurant group," Maya explained. "He's been trying to get our firm's business for months." "I can't believe this happened." Wallace sighed. "The manager mentioned something about a membership committee. A silver-haired gentleman seemed particularly concerned about our presence. Charles Whitfield," Maya said immediately. "Old money, big donor to all the conservative causes. He's on the club's executive committee, but he doesn't actually own the place." She paused, and they could practically hear her mind working. "Grandpa, this is textbook discrimination. We can file a complaint tomorrow." Wallace exchanged a look with Eleanor. "Maya, your grandmother and I have lived long enough to pick our battles carefully." "This is exactly the battle worth picking," Maya insisted. "You're Wallace Ford. You spent your career fighting exactly this kind of injustice." The words hung in the air. Wallace felt the weight of his reputation, the expectations that came with being the Honorable Judge Ford, the man who had helped dismantle housing discrimination in 3 states, who had sentenced corrupt officials regardless of their political connections, who had mentored dozens of young black attorneys now practicing across the country. "Let us sleep on it," Eleanor suggested gently. "It's been a long evening." After they hung up, Wallace moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street. Their neighborhood had been one of the first in the city to integrate, back when they were newlyweds. They had faced worse than tonight: burning crosses, threatening calls, broken windows. "You're thinking about Clement's case," Eleanor said, coming to stand beside him. Wallace nodded. In 1975, he had represented a black businessman denied membership to a city commerce club. The victory had helped open doors for an entire generation of entrepreneurs. "Different times," Wallace murmured. "Different tactics, same prejudice," Eleanor countered. She touched his arm. "What would you tell your clerks if they brought this case to you?" Wallace smiled despite himself. Eleanor had always known how to bring him back to his principles when weariness tempted him toward compromise. By morning, the decision was made. Maya arrived carrying a leather portfolio and a determined expression that reminded Wallace of Eleanor in her younger days. "I've already spoken with Sarah Chin," Maya said, referring to a civil rights attorney known for high-profile discrimination cases. "She's willing to take this on immediately." "That won't be necessary," Wallace said calmly. "I'll handle this myself." Maya looked surprised. "Grandpa, you haven't practiced law in decades. Some skills you don't forget." Wallace picked up his reading glasses. "But I will need your help drafting the initial complaint. And I'd like to review the city's current public accommodation ordinances." They spent the morning at the dining room table, 3 generations of legal minds working as one. Eleanor pulled research from her old constitutional law cases. Maya brought the fresh perspective of current practice. Wallace provided the strategic overview, his judicial experience guiding their approach. By afternoon, Daniel Hoffman was being served with papers at the Cartwright Club. "This is ridiculous," Daniel sputtered to the restaurant's attorney. "They couldn't have been members," and Mr. Whitfield specifically pointed out. "Mr. Whitfield doesn't own this establishment," the lawyer interrupted, scanning the complaint with growing concern. "And did you bother checking who these people were before you escorted them out?" "They were just an elderly couple," Daniel said defensively. "How was I supposed to know?" "That's exactly the point," the lawyer cut in sharply. "You didn't know who Wallace Ford was because you made assumptions based solely on his race." Daniel's face flushed. "That's not." "Wallace Ford," the lawyer continued, "is a retired federal judge who served on the bench for nearly 3 decades. His wife is Eleanor Ford, former professor of constitutional law at the State University, who literally wrote the textbook that most law students still use today." The blood drained from Daniel's face. "I had no idea. It gets worse." According to this filing, they're alleging violations of civil rights statutes, state public accommodation laws, and breach of contract since they had a confirmed reservation. The lawyer closed the folder. "And they've requested a jury trial." Daniel sank into a chair. "Can we settle this quietly?" "That ship has sailed," the lawyer said grimly. "The local news just called asking for comment. Apparently, their granddaughter is Maya Stevens." "Who?" "The civil rights attorney who just won that major case against Metropolitan Hospital last month." The lawyer's phone buzzed with another message. "And it seems Judge Ford's former clerks are organizing some kind of response. This is going to get very public very quickly." Outside the restaurant, a small group of protesters had already gathered. Someone had tipped off local activists, and social media was beginning to buzz with outrage. The hashtag Judge Ford Excluded was trending locally. At home, Wallace watched the first news reports with a mixture of satisfaction and discomfort. He had never sought the spotlight during his career, preferring to let his rulings speak for themselves. Now his personal experience was becoming a public example. "Are you ready for this?" Eleanor asked, joining him on the sofa. Wallace took her hand, thinking of the countless battles they had fought side by side, from protest marches to courtroom challenges to quietly supporting each other through decades of subtle slights and barriers. "With you," he said. "Always." On the television, the reporter was saying, "Sources tell us the couple's complaint will be heard by Judge Marlene Washington, who reportedly studied under Eleanor Ford at law school and clerked for Judge Wallace Ford early in her career." Daniel Hoffman's day was about to get much worse. The morning newspaper carried the story on its front page. Retired federal judge files discrimination suit against exclusive club. Accompanying the article was a dignified portrait of Wallace and Eleanor from a law school dedication ceremony 5 years earlier. Wallace read the piece carefully over breakfast, noting both its factual reporting and subtle framing. The journalist had done her homework, outlining Wallace's distinguished career on the federal bench and Eleanor's groundbreaking work in constitutional law education. "They did their research," Eleanor commented, pouring more coffee. "They even mentioned your Townsend decision." The Townsend case had been one of Wallace's most significant rulings, striking down a system of differential treatment in state contracting that had effectively excluded minority-owned businesses. It had earned him both praise and death threats. "Maya's influence, I suspect," Wallace replied. "She knows which cases define my career." Their phone began ringing at 8:15 a.m. and barely stopped all morning. Former colleagues, clerks, students, and friends called to offer support and in some cases legal assistance. By noon, Wallace had politely declined offers of representation from 3 former attorneys general and a prominent civil rights organization. This isn't about showcasing legal firepower, he explained to Eleanor after the latest call. This is about fundamental principles. Shortly after lunch, their doorbell rang. Eleanor opened it to find Thomas Crawford, owner of the restaurant group that included the Cartwright Club, standing on their porch looking deeply uncomfortable. "Mrs. Ford," he said, removing his hat, "I wonder if I might speak with you and the judge." Eleanor regarded him coolly. "We're represented by counsel now, Mr. Crawford. It would be inappropriate to discuss the case directly." "I understand completely," Crawford said quickly. "I've already contacted your granddaughter about formal channels for resolution. I'm here personally to offer my deepest apologies for what happened. It's inexcusable." Wallace appeared in the doorway behind Eleanor. "An apology is appreciated, Mr. Crawford, but it doesn't address the underlying issues." Crawford nodded earnestly. "Which is exactly why I'd like to discuss potential remedies that go beyond financial settlement. May I come in for just a few minutes?" Eleanor looked to Wallace, who nodded slightly. They led Crawford to the living room, where family photos lined the walls. Wallace in his judicial robes, Eleanor receiving an honorary doctorate, both of them with various presidents and Supreme Court justices over the decades. Crawford took in the evidence of their storied careers, visibly processing just how significantly his manager had erred. "I want to be clear," Crawford began. "Daniel Hoffman acted without authorization when he asked you to leave. We don't have a formal membership requirement for the dining room where you were seated. Then why were we removed?" Eleanor asked directly. Crawford shifted uncomfortably. "Charles Whitfield is an influential patron with significant investments in our restaurant group. He expressed concerns about your presence, and your manager chose to accommodate his prejudice rather than honor our reservation," Wallace stated flatly. "Yes." Crawford didn't attempt to deny it. "It was wrong. Completely wrong. And I want to make it right." Wallace leaned forward. "Mr. Crawford, I spent 30 years on the federal bench. During that time, I heard countless defendants express remorse, not for their actions, but for the consequences they faced. Which category do you fall into?" The question hung in the air, direct and unsparing. Crawford had the grace to look genuinely ashamed. "I benefited from a system that's fundamentally unfair," he admitted after a moment. "I allowed my establishment to become a space where people like Charles Whitfield could enforce their prejudices without challenge. Your lawsuit is entirely justified." It wasn't the answer Wallace had expected. He exchanged a glance with Eleanor, whose expression softened slightly. "What do you propose?" Wallace asked. "I'd like your help transforming the Cartwright Club," Crawford said. "Not just settling the lawsuit, but making substantive changes to our policies, our hiring practices, our membership structure, everything." As Crawford outlined his initial ideas, Wallace remained skeptical but attentive. He had heard promises before, but there was something in Crawford's demeanor that suggested genuine recognition of the damage done. After Crawford left, promising to have formal proposals sent through proper legal channels, Eleanor turned to Wallace. "What do you think?" Wallace considered the question carefully. "I think he's frightened of the publicity, but fear can sometimes motivate meaningful change." If nothing else, Eleanor noted, Charles Whitfield must be furious that his little power play has backfired so spectacularly. Indeed, across town, Charles Whitfield was in the midst of a blistering phone call with Daniel Hoffman. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Whitfield demanded. "Wallace Ford isn't just any judge. He's the judge who ruled against Westridge Development in '92. "I don't understand what that means," Daniel responded, feeling increasingly out of his depth. "It means," Whitfield seethed, "that he ruled against my father's company in a landmark discrimination case that cost us millions. And now you've handed him the perfect opportunity for a second round." As the day progressed, more details about Wallace and Eleanor's careers emerged in the media. Former law clerks appeared on local news to share stories of Wallace's integrity on the bench. Law professors cited Eleanor's groundbreaking articles on equal protection. What had begun as a local story was expanding as national outlets picked up the narrative. At dinner, Maya updated them on the legal developments. Judge Washington has set an expedited hearing schedule, she reported, and we've already received 3 offers of settlement. Thomas Crawford came by personally this afternoon, Wallace informed her. Maya looked surprised. That wasn't clear through me. What did he want? To apologize, Eleanor said, and to discuss broader changes to the club's practices. Don't trust him, Maya warned. These types always talk reform when they're facing bad press. Wallace considered his granddaughter's skepticism so reminiscent of his own at her age. Perhaps. But sometimes, Maya, the lawsuit is just the beginning of the conversation. That evening, as Wallace prepared for bed, he found himself thinking about his early days as a young attorney. How many restaurants and hotels had turned him away? How many subtle and not-so-subtle barriers had he faced? The memory of those indignities had never faded, but neither had his commitment to transformation rather than simple retribution. "You thinking about Justice Thompson's advice?" Eleanor said, recognizing the thoughtful expression on her husband's face. Wallace smiled. Clarence Thompson had been the first black justice on the state Supreme Court and Wallace's mentor. The law can compel behavior, he would say, but only changed hearts can sustain justice. "We have an opportunity here," Wallace said slowly. "Not just to win damages, but to create lasting change." Eleanor nodded, understanding as always. "Then we'd better be ready for the hard work that comes after the headlines fade." Outside their peaceful home, the story continued to spread. By morning, what had begun as a simple dinner reservation would evolve into something much more significant, a test case that would force a reckoning not just for the Cartwright Club, but for the entire community it represented. The courtroom was packed for the preliminary hearing. Judge Marlene Washington, a formidable presence in her robes, surveyed the crowded gallery with practiced neutrality. News crews waited outside, barred from bringing cameras into the federal courthouse, but eager for statements when proceedings concluded. Wallace sat beside Maya at the plaintiff's table, Eleanor just behind them. Across the aisle, the Cartwright Club's legal team had expanded to include a prominent civil rights attorney of their own, a transparent attempt to blunt the optics of the case. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Washington entered. Wallace rose smoothly, the familiar courtroom rituals stirring memories of his own time on the bench. For 30 years, he had been the one entering to those words, the one weighing evidence and interpreting law. Now he was the plaintiff, seeking justice rather than dispensing it. Judge Washington nodded to Wallace with subtle respect before beginning the proceedings. "We're here on Ford versus Cartwright Club. I've reviewed the initial filings. Before we proceed further, I understand the defendants wish to enter a motion." The Cartwright Club's lead attorney stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We move to dismiss on the grounds that the private club exemption under Title II of the Civil Rights Act applies in this case." Maya rose immediately. "Your Honor, the Cartwright Club operates as a public restaurant with some membership components. More importantly, my grandparents had a confirmed reservation through the restaurant's public booking system, creating a contract that was breached." Judge Washington turned to the defense. "Counselor, are you suggesting that the defendants would have legal justification to discriminate even if discrimination occurred?" The attorney shifted uncomfortably. "We're not admitting discrimination, Your Honor. We're simply noting that private clubs retain certain rights of association." "I understand the legal argument," Judge Washington replied coolly. "I'm more interested in whether your clients believe they would be justified in excluding guests based on race." The courtroom fell silent. Behind the defense table, Daniel Hoffman stared at the floor. "No, Your Honor," the attorney finally replied. "That is not our position." "Good. Motion denied." Judge Washington turned a page in her notes. "Now, before we proceed to discovery schedules, I want to address something. Judge Ford served on this bench with distinction for nearly 3 decades. Professor Ford has educated a generation of attorneys, including myself. She surveyed the courtroom. This case will be decided on its legal merits, but let the record reflect that the plaintiffs have contributed significantly to the very system of justice they now seek remedy from." The preliminary hearing continued with technical discussions of evidence preservation and witness lists. Wallace observed it all with the practiced eye of a former judge, noting both the legal maneuvering and the subtle shifts in the room as various parties realized the full weight of what they faced. As they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps. Maya stepped forward as their spokesperson, delivering a measured statement about equal treatment and the ongoing relevance of civil rights laws. Wallace and Eleanor stood dignified behind her, their presence speaking volumes without a word. Later that afternoon, they gathered in Maya's office to review developments. The law firm had assigned a junior associate to research the history of the Cartwright Club, and his findings were illuminating. The club was founded in 1925 as explicitly white only, the young man explained, spreading documents across the conference table. They removed the formal race restrictions from their bylaws in 1972, but maintained a sponsorship system that effectively continued the exclusion. Eleanor studied the membership rolls. When did they admit their first black member? 2010, the associate replied. Dr. William Harris, chief of surgery at University Hospital. Single token integration, Wallace commented. A common tactic, admit one highly qualified minority member, then point to them as evidence of inclusivity while maintaining the broader pattern. The associate nodded eagerly. Exactly, Judge Ford. And I found something else interesting. The club's physical location was purchased with a federal redevelopment grant in 1967, which included non-discrimination requirements that appear to have been ignored. Maya leaned forward. That could invalidate their private club exemption claim entirely. As they developed their legal strategy, across town Thomas Crawford was meeting with his management team, including a visibly stressed Daniel Hoffman. The press is killing us, Crawford's public relations director reported. Reservations are down 40% since the story broke. 3 corporate clients have canceled their holiday events. What about Whitfield and his circle? Crawford asked. They're still coming in, but they're practically the only ones, Daniel replied. We had 6 tables total last night. Crawford rubbed his temples. We need to contain this. Daniel, you'll be taking a leave of absence effective immediately. Sir. Daniel looked shocked. I was following protocol. There was no protocol for what you did, Crawford interrupted harshly. You made a judgment call based on Whitfield's prejudice, and now we're all paying for it. As the meeting continued, Crawford outlined a crisis management plan that included diversity training, revised policies, and a public statement expressing regret. What he didn't share was his private meeting with Wallace and Eleanor, or the more substantive changes he was considering. That evening, Wallace received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar, though he hadn't heard it in years. Wallace? It's Regina Washington. Justice Washington, Wallace acknowledged warmly. Regina Washington had been appointed to the state Supreme Court 5 years earlier, after a distinguished career as a civil rights attorney. She had also been one of Eleanor's most promising students. I heard about what happened, she said. Marlene told me she's presiding over your case. She's handling it with appropriate judicial distance, Wallace assured her. I'd expect nothing less. Regina paused. But that's not why I'm calling. The governor asked me to reach out to you privately. Wallace raised an eyebrow, motioning for Eleanor to pick up the extension. About the lawsuit? Indirectly. The Cartwright Club situation has exposed some broader issues. The governor is forming a commission on discrimination in public accommodations, and he'd like you and Eleanor to co-chair it. Wallace and Eleanor exchanged glances. The offer represented an opportunity to address systemic issues beyond their individual case. The lawsuit would continue on its own track, Regina clarified. This would be about longer-term policy recommendations. We'll consider it, Wallace promised. After hanging up, Eleanor sat beside Wallace on the sofa. A commission? That's playing the long game. It could have real impact, Wallace acknowledged. But I wonder if it's also an attempt to shift the conversation away from the Cartwright Club specifically. Eleanor took his hand. We've always said one case can't fix everything. Maybe this is how we address the bigger picture while still holding them accountable. Wallace nodded slowly. The lawsuit had already sparked wider conversations than he had anticipated. What had begun as a personal indignity was evolving into something with potential for broader impact. Later that night, unable to sleep, Wallace found himself in his study looking through old photographs. There he was as a young attorney, standing on courthouse steps after winning his first major civil rights case. There was Eleanor marching in Montgomery, determination etched on her youthful face. So many battles fought, so many victories that had seemed transformative in the moment. Yet here they were, still fighting variations of the same fight decades later. What would make this time different? The question followed him back to bed, where Eleanor stirred as he slipped under the covers. "We'll find the answer," she murmured sleepily, somehow knowing his thoughts as she had for 50 years. Wallace smiled in the darkness. With Eleanor by his side, he had always found the path forward, even when justice seemed most elusive. The deposition room felt smaller than Wallace remembered from his days presiding over legal proceedings. Now seated on the other side of the table, he watched Daniel Hoffman fidget with his tie as Maya prepared her recording equipment. "Please state your name and position for the record." Maya began once the formalities were complete. "Daniel Hoffman, general manager of the Cartwright Club," Daniel replied, his voice tight with nervousness. "Mr. Hoffman, please describe the events of May 15th regarding my grandparents' dinner reservation." Daniel cleared his throat. Judge and Mrs. Ford arrived at approximately 7 p.m. with a confirmed reservation. They were seated in the main dining room and had ordered their meal when I approached their table. "And why did you approach their table specifically?" Maya pressed. Daniel glanced at his attorney, who nodded slightly. Charles Whitfield, a longtime patron, had expressed concerns about their presence. What specifically were his concerns? He said they weren't members and shouldn't be in that section of the restaurant. "Did Mr. Whitfield mention my grandparents' race?" "Not directly, no." "Did he need to?" Daniel's attorney interjected. "Objection." Calls for speculation. Maya remained focused on Daniel. "In your 8 years managing the Cartwright Club, how many white patrons have you asked to leave due to membership concerns?" Daniel's face flushed. "I don't recall any specific instances." "So the number would be 0? "I can't say with certainty. Your records indicate 17 incidents of non-members dining in the main room in the past year alone." Maya interrupted, sliding a document across the table. "All white patrons. None were asked to leave." "Can you explain the difference in treatment?" As the deposition continued, Wallace observed Daniel's growing discomfort. The young manager wasn't a hardened bigot, just a man who had absorbed and implemented the unspoken biases of the institution he served. After 3 hours of detailed questioning, Maya concluded the deposition. As they gathered their materials, Daniel approached Wallace hesitantly. "Judge Ford, I want to say personally how sorry I am for what happened." Wallace studied him thoughtfully. "Mr. Hoffman, do you understand why we're pursuing this case?" Daniel nodded. "Because what I did was discriminatory and wrong." "That's part of it," Wallace acknowledged. "But there's something more fundamental. My wife and I have spent our lives working within systems to change them. This isn't about punishing you individually. It's about ensuring the next couple who looks like us doesn't face the same treatment." Understanding dawned in Daniel's eyes. "I never thought of myself as I was perpetuating anything. I was just following what I thought were the rules." "That's precisely the problem," Wallace replied quietly. "Unexamined rules often preserve injustice without anyone taking responsibility for it." The conversation stayed with Wallace as he and Eleanor prepared for their next public appearance. The governor had announced their appointment to the newly formed Commission on Public Accommodation Discrimination, generating fresh media attention. "Are you ready for the cameras?" Eleanor asked, adjusting Wallace's tie in their bedroom. "I spent 3 decades keeping my opinions off my face in contentious trials," Wallace replied with a small smile. "I think I can handle a press conference." The governor's office was crowded with reporters when they arrived. Standing at the podium, the governor introduced them with evident pride. "Judge Wallace Ford and Professor Eleanor Ford represent the best of our state's legal tradition," he declared. "Their experience and wisdom will guide this commission toward meaningful policy recommendations." Wallace stepped to the microphone, feeling the weight of expectation. "We accept this responsibility with full awareness of both the progress made and the distance yet to travel. This commission will examine not just blatant discrimination, but the subtle barriers that persist in our society." Eleanor joined him. "Our goals are practical: to develop clear guidelines for businesses, strengthen enforcement mechanisms, and create educational resources that address unconscious bias." A reporter called out, "Will your involvement affect your ongoing lawsuit against the Cartwright Club?" "The lawsuit proceeds independently," Wallace replied smoothly. Our work on this commission addresses broader systemic issues. As they fielded questions, Wallace noticed Thomas Crawford standing at the back of the room, observing quietly. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. Later that afternoon, Crawford requested another meeting, this time at Maya's office to maintain proper legal protocol. He arrived with a comprehensive proposal. "We want to settle the case," he began, "but not with a confidential financial agreement. We're proposing a consent decree that would include structural changes to our business model." Maya looked skeptical. "What kind of changes?" "First, eliminating the membership structure entirely and opening the restaurant to the public. Second, implementing a comprehensive training program developed by diversity experts. Third, establishing a scholarship fund for culinary students from underrepresented backgrounds." Wallace listened with interest as Crawford continued outlining his proposal. It was far more substantial than the typical damage control offered by businesses caught in discrimination scandals. "Why this approach?" Wallace asked when Crawford finished. "Most businesses in your position fight tooth and nail or try to buy silence with a settlement." Crawford considered the question carefully. "When I started in this business 30 years ago, exclusivity was our selling point. The world has changed, but we haven't changed with it." He looked directly at Wallace. "Your case forced me to confront that failure. I'd rather transform my business than defend practices I can no longer justify." After Crawford left, Maya turned to her grandparents. "What do you think? Is he sincere?" "Perhaps," Eleanor replied. "But intentions matter less than actions and accountability. We should consider his proposal seriously," Wallace added. "A public consent decree would have more lasting impact than a trial verdict and would establish a template for other businesses." As they discussed the potential settlement terms, adding provisions for monitoring and compliance, Wallace reflected on the unexpected direction the case had taken. What had begun as a personal affront was evolving into an opportunity for institutional change. That evening, the local news featured a different angle on the story. A group of former Cartwright Club employees had come forward describing a pattern of discriminatory practices beyond what had happened to the Fords. "The manager told us which tables to seat people at based on how they looked," a former host explained. "Minorities were always put near the kitchen or in the back corners." These new allegations strengthened the Fords' legal position while adding complexity to any potential resolution. The case was no longer just about one elderly couple's mistreatment, but about a systemic pattern affecting many others. Wallace watched the news coverage with mixed emotions. The widening scandal validated their decision to pursue the case, yet he took no pleasure in watching the public dismantling of an institution, however flawed. "Justice isn't always clean," Eleanor said, reading his expression. "Sometimes things need to be broken down before they can be rebuilt properly." Wallace nodded, remembering a similar conversation decades earlier when they were young activists debating tactics. Eleanor had always understood that creating change required both pressure and vision, the courage to challenge what was wrong, and the clarity to imagine something better. As they prepared for bed, their phone rang once more. It was Maya. "Grandpa, you won't believe this," she said urgently. "Charles Whitfield just gave an interview claiming he's being scapegoated. He's threatening to sue the Cartwright Club himself." The case that had begun with a quiet dinner reservation was growing more complex by the day. But as Wallace hung up the phone, he felt a familiar certainty settling over him. Complicated or not, this was exactly the kind of battle he and Eleanor had spent their lives fighting, and they would see it through to its conclusion. The morning headlines screamed across the front page. "Whitfield claims restaurant, thrown him under the bus in discrimination case." Below the headline was a photo of Charles Whitfield standing defiantly outside his estate, looking every inch the aggrieved patrician. "He's trying to rewrite history," Eleanor remarked over breakfast, scanning the article. "Listen to this. I merely inquired about club policies. I never suggested anyone should be removed from the premises." Wallace shook his head. Classic deflection strategy. Create confusion about the facts, shift blame to others. The article detailed Whitfield's new assertions that he was being unfairly portrayed as the villain. He had simply been asking questions about membership protocols. He claimed Crawford and Hoffman were using him as a convenient scapegoat to protect themselves. "This actually helps our case," Maya pointed out when she called to discuss the development. Whitfield's public statements contradict Daniel's deposition testimony. We can subpoena Whitfield now and force him to either repeat these claims under oath or admit he's lying. Wallace considered the implications. Whitfield won't back down easily. Men like him rarely do. They've spent lifetimes believing their position shields them from consequences. Then let's use that, Maya suggested. His arrogance makes him vulnerable. Later that morning, as rain streaked the windows of Maya's law office, the legal team gathered to revise their strategy. The conference room walls were now covered with timeline charts, witness statements, and excerpts from the Cartwright Club's internal policies. Whitfield's interview changes our approach, Maya explained to the junior associates. We need to schedule his deposition immediately before Crawford's team can coordinate stories with him. One of the associates raised his hand. But if Whitfield and Crawford are now at odds, doesn't that weaken our argument about institutional discrimination? Wallace leaned forward. No, it actually reveals it more clearly. What we're seeing is the breakdown of what sociologists call plausible deniability, the system where everyone participates in discrimination but no one takes direct responsibility. Eleanor added, institutions maintain discriminatory practices by creating buffer zones of policy and protocol. When exposed, these buffers become the focus, protecting the underlying biases from scrutiny. The young lawyers absorbed this lesson from two people who had spent decades dismantling such systems from within. The strategy session continued with renewed focus, mapping out approaches for the depositions and potential trial testimony. Across town, Thomas Crawford was facing his own crisis meeting with shareholders and legal advisors. The Cartwright Club's reputation was in free fall, with cancellations mounting and social media campaigns calling for boycotts of all his restaurant properties. Whitfield has made this exponentially worse, Crawford's attorney explained. His interview contradicts our official position and opens new avenues of inquiry. Can we distance ourselves from him? Crawford asked. He's been on your executive committee for 15 years and holds significant shares in the parent company, the attorney replied grimly. The connection is well established. Crawford rubbed his temples. And our settlement offer to the Fords? Still on the table, but Judge Ford hasn't formally responded. His granddaughter requested additional documentation about historical membership practices before proceeding. The rain continued throughout the day, casting a gray pall over the city. Wallace spent the afternoon reviewing materials from the governor's new commission, preparing for their first formal meeting the following week. The scope of work was broader than he had initially expected, encompassing everything from restaurant discrimination to housing, employment, and financial services. They're giving us real authority, Eleanor noted as she reviewed the documents with him. This could have significant impact beyond our individual case. Wallace nodded thoughtfully. The question becomes, how do we balance the specific remedy we're seeking with these broader opportunities for change? That evening, they received an unexpected visitor. The doorbell rang just after dinner, and Wallace opened it to find Daniel Hoffman standing on their porch, raindrops glistening on his coat. Judge Ford, Daniel said awkwardly. I apologize for coming unannounced. I know I shouldn't be contacting you directly during litigation, but I needed to speak with you. Wallace hesitated, then stepped back. Come in, Mr. Hoffman. But I should remind you that anything you say may be considered relevant to ongoing legal proceedings. Daniel nodded, following Wallace to the living room where Eleanor sat reading. She looked up with surprise but gestured for him to sit. I've resigned from the Cartwright Club, Daniel began without preamble. Effective immediately. I see, Wallace replied neutrally. May I ask why? Because Whitfield was lying in that interview. I did exactly what he asked that night, removed you, because he didn't want black patrons in the main dining room. It wasn't the first time either. Daniel's voice shook slightly. He's done it before, and management has always accommodated him. We all knew it was wrong, but no one challenged it. Eleanor leaned forward. Why tell us this now? Because I've been making excuses to myself, to my family, to your attorneys. Pretending I was just following protocol when I knew exactly what I was doing. Daniel met their eyes directly. I'm here to tell you I'm willing to testify to all of it. The pattern of discrimination, Whitfield's specific instructions, everything. The room fell silent except for the soft patter of rain against the windows. Wallace studied the young man's face, looking for signs of calculation or self-interest, but saw only exhausted resolve. "This will cost you professionally," Wallace noted. Daniel nodded. "Probably. But continuing to be complicit would cost me something more important." After Daniel left, promising to contact Maya's office the next day to provide a formal statement, Wallace and Eleanor sat in thoughtful silence. "Do you believe him?" Eleanor finally asked. "I believe he's genuinely remorseful," Wallace replied. "Whether that remorse translates to meaningful testimony remains to be seen. If he does testify about systematic discrimination, it changes the scope of the case." Wallace nodded. From an isolated incident to a pattern and practice, the legal implications are significant. Later that night, as thunder rumbled distantly, Wallace stood at their bedroom window, watching lightning illuminate the neighborhood in brief, stark flashes. The case had grown beyond what he had initially sought. What had begun as a personal stand against an individual slight was expanding into something that might fundamentally change an institution, and perhaps others like it. He thought of the many cases he had presided over during his judicial career. How many had started small but revealed larger patterns of injustice? How many had provided opportunities for genuine transformation rather than mere punishment? Eleanor joined him at the window, slipping her arm through his. "You're wondering if we've opened Pandora's box." Wallace smiled slightly. "After all these years, is there anything you don't know about what I'm thinking?" "Very little," she admitted. "And I also know you're remembering what Justice Marshall told you when you were sworn in." The memory was vivid. Thurgood Marshall, the legal giant who had argued Brown versus Board of Education before becoming the first Black Supreme Court justice, had attended Wallace's investiture ceremony. Afterward, he had taken Wallace aside. "This robe isn't just about applying the law as it exists," Marshall had told him. "It's about seeing the law as it could be, more just, more equal, more human." Wallace had carried those words throughout his judicial career, seeking not just to interpret the law narrowly, but to understand its deeper purpose in creating a more just society. Daniel's testimony could be crucial, Eleanor said, bringing him back to the present. Not just for our case, but for revealing how discrimination persists in more subtle forms. Wallace nodded. "The question is whether the system is ready to acknowledge those subtleties." As lightning flashed again, Wallace thought about the layers of this case, the personal affront they had experienced, the institutional practices that enabled it, and the broader societal attitudes that made those practices seem normal to so many. Change rarely came from a single lawsuit or policy shift. It came from persistent pressure applied at multiple points, from individual conscience to institutional accountability to legislative reform. Perhaps this case, combined with their work on the Governor's Commission, could address all three levels simultaneously. The storm was passing now, the thunder growing more distant. Wallace turned from the window, his resolution strengthened. "Tomorrow we need to speak with Maya about modifying our approach," he said. "Daniel's testimony opens new possibilities for addressing the broader pattern, not just our individual experience." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the shift in his thinking. "From case to cause," she said softly. "Just like the old days." "Some battles," Wallace replied, "are worth fighting more than once." The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and spectators as Wallace and Eleanor arrived for the hearing. News of Daniel Hoffman's dramatic reversal and offer to testify had transformed public interest in the case from a local story to national news. Civil rights organizations had filed amicus briefs, and the Justice Department had announced it was monitoring the proceedings. Maya met them at the courthouse entrance, impeccably professional in a tailored suit but with nervous energy radiating from her. "The courtroom's packed," she warned them. Judge Washington had to issue overflow seating arrangements. Inside, the gallery was indeed filled to capacity. Wallace recognized faces from across the city's political and business landscape, along with civil rights activists and community leaders. In the front row, directly behind the defense table, sat Charles Whitfield, his expression imperious as he consulted with his personal attorney. Thomas Crawford occupied the defendant's table with his legal team, looking distinctly uncomfortable with Whitfield's proximity. The rift between them had widened into a chasm, with each now effectively blaming the other for what had happened. "All rise," The bailiff called as Judge Washington entered. Once everyone was seated, Judge Washington surveyed the crowded courtroom with a measured gaze. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this is a court of law, not a media spectacle or political forum. I expect decorum from all parties. She turned to the attorneys. I understand there have been significant developments since our last hearing. Ms. Stevens, please update the court. Maya rose. Your Honor, we have amended our complaint to allege a pattern and practice of discrimination based on new evidence. Former Cartwright Club manager Daniel Hoffman has provided a sworn affidavit detailing multiple incidents where patrons were treated differently based on race, often at the specific direction of members of the club's executive committee. Judge Washington nodded. And the defendant's response? Crawford's attorney stood. Your Honor, my client Cartwright Holdings takes these allegations extremely seriously. We have expanded our settlement offer to include structural changes to our business practices, comprehensive training programs, and community investments. And do these offers address the pattern and practice allegations? We believe they do, Your Honor, the attorney replied. Mr. Crawford is prepared to testify about specific steps being taken to transform the institution's culture and policies. Judge Washington made a note. And what about Mr. Whitfield? I understand he has sought to intervene in this case. Whitfield's attorney rose. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Whitfield believes he's being unfairly scapegoated for institutional policies he did not create. He seeks to protect his reputation from defamatory claims. Maya responded immediately. Your Honor, Mr. Whitfield was named in Mr. Hoffman's sworn testimony as explicitly directing discriminatory actions. He's a proper party to these proceedings. Judge Washington considered this briefly. Mr. Whitfield's motion to intervene is granted, but limited to matters directly involving allegations against him. She turned to Crawford's attorney. Now, regarding the settlement proposal, has plaintiff's counsel had sufficient time to review the terms? We have, Your Honor, Maya replied. While we appreciate the substantial nature of the offer, we believe several key provisions need strengthening, particularly around accountability measures and verification protocols. I see. Judge Washington reviewed her notes. Given the expanded scope of this case and its potential implications beyond the immediate parties, I'm ordering a settlement conference with a magistrate judge before we proceed further. She fixed each party with a direct look. I strongly encourage all parties to approach this process in good faith. As the hearing concluded, Wallace observed Whitfield's barely contained anger. The man had clearly expected Judge Washington to dismiss him from the case, not integrate him more formally into the proceedings. Outside the courtroom, reporters shouted questions as they made their way down the courthouse steps. Maya fielded most inquiries with practiced skill, but one reporter called out directly to Wallace. Judge Ford, do you believe justice is possible when the system itself is biased? Wallace paused, the question resonating with thoughts he'd been wrestling with throughout his career. Justice isn't a static achievement, he replied. It's an ongoing process of recognizing wrongs and creating structures that prevent their recurrence. Today's hearing is one step in that process. The settlement conference was scheduled for the following week, giving all parties time to prepare. In Maya's office that afternoon, they reviewed the strengthened proposal that Crawford's team had submitted. They're offering substantial changes, Maya acknowledged. Complete restructuring of membership policies, third-party auditing of practices, financial commitments to culinary education for underrepresented communities. Eleanor studied the document. What about accountability for past discrimination? That's where it gets complicated, Maya replied. Crawford is willing to acknowledge the pattern, but wants to frame it as unconscious bias rather than deliberate exclusion. Whitfield, meanwhile, denies everything and threatens to sue anyone who suggests he acted with discriminatory intent. Wallace considered this tension. The truth lies somewhere between systemic patterns and individual choices. Both must be addressed for genuine change. As they continued analyzing the proposal, the receptionist announced an unexpected visitor, Regina Washington, the state Supreme Court Justice and Eleanor's former student. I hope I'm not interrupting, Justice Washington said as she entered the conference room. I wanted to speak with you both before the settlement conference. After exchanging warm greetings, Justice Washington explained her purpose. The governor asked me to convey that whatever resolution you reach in this case, the Commission's work will continue with full support. He believes, as do I, that your experience can help shape more effective anti-discrimination policies statewide. We appreciate that commitment, Wallace replied. There's a delicate balance between resolving our individual case and advancing broader systemic change. Justice Washington nodded, which is precisely why I came personally. The judiciary has limitations in addressing structural discrimination. Legislative and executive action must complement case-by-case litigation. Their conversation continued, exploring how the Cartwright Club case might serve as a catalyst for wider reforms. Justice Washington shared insights from her own experiences pushing for change within legal institutions, while Eleanor outlined preliminary ideas for the Commission's work. As Justice Washington prepared to leave, she paused at the door. One more thing. Charles Whitfield sits on several state boards and commissions. The governor is reviewing all those appointments in light of recent revelations. The message was clear. The repercussions of this case extended far beyond a single restaurant or even a single lawsuit. That evening, Wallace received a phone call from Thomas Crawford requesting a private meeting before the settlement conference. I know this is unorthodox, Crawford said, but I believe we share a fundamental goal of making lasting change, not just resolving a lawsuit. After consulting with Maya, who reluctantly approved with strict parameters, Wallace agreed to meet Crawford at a neutral location, a quiet conference room at the public library. Crawford arrived alone, carrying a thick folder. Thank you for meeting me, Judge Ford. I wanted you to see something before our formal negotiations. He opened the folder, revealing architectural renderings and program descriptions. These are the plans we've developed over the past few weeks. Not just for policy changes, but for physically transforming the Cartwright Club. Wallace reviewed the materials with interest. The plans showed the elimination of the exclusive dining areas in favor of a more open concept, the creation of a culinary training center in what had been private meeting rooms, and community spaces designed to welcome diverse groups. This goes beyond what your attorneys proposed, Wallace noted. Crawford nodded. Because this isn't just about legal settlement anymore. It's about creating something that reflects values I should have embraced long ago. He hesitated. I also want to show you this. He handed Wallace a letter of resignation from the Cartwright Club's executive committee, signed by Charles Whitfield and dated 2 years earlier. Whitfield threatened to resign when we first discussed diversifying our membership. I convinced him to stay, prioritizing his financial support over doing what was right. Wallace studied the letter. Why show me this now? Because I want you to understand that I'm not just responding to public pressure. I've been complicit in maintaining a discriminatory environment by compromising with people like Whitfield for years. Crawford met Wallace's eyes directly. Whatever happens with the lawsuit, I'm committed to transformation, not just policy changes, but a fundamental shift in what the Cartwright Club represents. As Wallace left the meeting, he felt a cautious optimism. Crawford's presentation suggested a genuine commitment to change, not just damage control. Whether that commitment would translate into meaningful action remained to be seen, but the foundation seemed promising. At home, he shared the developments with Eleanor as they prepared for dinner. Do you trust him? Eleanor asked. Wallace considered the question carefully. I trust that he wants to do the right thing now. Whether that's from genuine moral awakening or pragmatic business sense doesn't matter as much as the results. Eleanor smiled. You always did focus on outcomes over intentions. It's what made you an effective judge. And you always focused on transforming systems, not just winning cases, Wallace replied. It's why your students have had such impact. They continued discussing strategy as the settlement conference approached. The case had evolved far beyond their initial goals, opening possibilities for change that extended well beyond one restaurant or one evening's indignity. As Wallace prepared for bed that night, he found himself thinking about the young valet who had apologized to them on the night of the incident. Small acts of conscience, he reflected, sometimes grew into movements more powerful than anyone could anticipate. The lawsuit that began with a denied dinner reservation was becoming a catalyst for confronting not just the Cartwright Club's practices, but the subtle ways discrimination persisted in spaces that claimed to be progressive and inclusive. Tomorrow's settlement conference would determine whether that potential will be realized or diminished. Wallace fell asleep, mentally preparing for one more important negotiation in a lifetime filled with them, perhaps the last major battle in his long career of fighting for justice. Key provisions included: 1. The elimination of the Cartwright Club's exclusive membership structure. 2. The establishment of a culinary arts training program focused on underrepresented communities. 3. A public apology to Wallace and Eleanor Ford. 4. Mandatory anti-discrimination training for all staff. 5. The creation of a community advisory board with oversight authority. 6. Physical renovation of the facility to remove segregated dining areas. 7. Financial commitments to civil rights organizations. 8. Regular audits and public reporting on diversity metrics. As they prepared to leave, Wallace found himself standing beside Whitfield near the water cooler. "You know, this changes nothing fundamental," Whitfield said quietly, hostility barely contained. "People will still prefer to associate with their own kind. You can't legislate preferences." Wallace regarded him thoughtfully. "Perhaps not. But we can create spaces where people have the opportunity to discover their common humanity. That's what these reforms aim to do." Whitfield scoffed and walked away without responding. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered again, alerted that a settlement was near. Maya managed the media response, explaining that final details were being formalized and a public announcement would follow. As they drove home, Eleanor reached over to take Wallace's hand. "Are you satisfied with the outcome?" Wallace considered the question carefully. "The settlement achieves more than I initially thought possible. The Cartwright Club will be fundamentally transformed, and the case has already sparked wider conversations about hidden discrimination." "But," Eleanor prompted, hearing the reservation in his voice. "But changing policies doesn't automatically change hearts," Wallace admitted. Whitfield's parting comment reminded me how deeply entrenched some attitudes remain. Eleanor nodded, understanding. "That's why the commission work matters so much. Legal victories create space for change, but cultural transformation requires ongoing engagement." That evening, as news of the settlement began to spread, their phone rang consistently with calls from friends, former colleagues, and civil rights organizations offering congratulations. The story was already being framed as a significant victory, not just for the Fords personally, but for equal access to public accommodations. Wallace accepted the congratulations graciously, while maintaining a clear-eyed perspective on the work that remained. Throughout his career, he had seen how initial celebrations of legal victories often gave way to the complex, unglamorous work of implementation and enforcement. As he prepared for bed, Wallace found himself thinking about the junior associates on Maya's legal team, the young people who had worked behind the scenes on research and documentation. For them, this case represented not just historical continuation but fresh engagement with issues of justice and equality. "What are you thinking about?" Eleanor asked, joining him in their bedroom. "The next generation," Wallace replied. "Maya and her colleagues. They're taking up the work we began, but in their own way, with their own tools." Eleanor smiled. "That's always been the point, hasn't it? Not just to win individual battles, but to ensure others would continue fighting long after we're gone." Wallace nodded, remembering all the young lawyers he had mentored during his years on the bench, the students Eleanor had inspired in her classroom. So many of them now occupy positions of influence throughout the legal system. Tomorrow would bring the formal announcement of the settlement, the beginning of implementation. There would be resistances and setbacks, compromises and adjustments. But tonight, Wallace allowed himself to feel a measure of satisfaction in what they had accomplished. Not merely the vindication of their personal dignity, but another step forward in the long journey toward justice, a journey they had been walking together for 50 years, hand in hand, neither wavering nor surrendering. 50 years, Wallace murmured, echoing his thought from the night of their anniversary. And still fighting the same fights. But not in the same way, Eleanor reminded him gently. And not alone. She was right, as she so often was. The battles continued, but the battlefield had shifted. And all around them, allies were taking up the cause, some new to the struggle, others carrying forward legacies of their own. Wallace fell asleep thinking not of the past, but of the future they were still helping to shape, even in the twilight of their remarkable lives. The press conference announcing the settlement agreement took place on the steps of the federal courthouse. News cameras lined the perimeter as Thomas Crawford stepped to the microphone first, flanked by his legal team. Today marks a turning point for the Cartwright Club and for me personally. Crawford began, his voice carrying across the crowded plaza. The settlement we've reached with Judge and Mrs. Ford acknowledges past failures and commits to meaningful transformation. Crawford detailed the key provisions of the agreement, emphasizing the structural changes that would remake the restaurant's physical space and operational model. The exclusive members-only dining areas that have defined the Cartwright Club for nearly a century will be eliminated, he announced. In their place, we will create an inclusive environment welcoming to all patrons, regardless of race, background, or status. He then turned to address Wallace and Eleanor directly. To Judge and Mrs. Ford, I offer my deepest apology. The treatment you experienced was inexcusable and reflects institutional practices that have no place in our society. Your dignity in responding to that injustice has created an opportunity for genuine change. As Crawford stepped back, Wallace approached the microphone. Cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the image of the distinguished former judge, his bearing calm and authoritative. My wife and I accept Mr. Crawford's apology and commend his commitment to transformation, Wallace stated. This case has never been solely about our individual experience, but about addressing patterns that affect many in our community. He continued with measured eloquence, placing the incident within the broader context of ongoing struggles for equality. What happened to us was not unique. It represents the subtle discrimination that persists even as more blatant forms have receded. The settlement we've reached aims to address both the specific incident and the underlying systems that enabled it. Eleanor joined him at the microphone. As educators and legal professionals, we have always believed in the power of institutions to change when confronted with their failings. The Cartwright Club now has the opportunity to become a model for how establishments can evolve toward genuine inclusion. Questions from reporters followed, probing various aspects of the settlement and its implementation timeline. Maya fielded the more technical legal inquiries, while Crawford addressed questions about business impacts and community reactions. Noticeably absent from the proceedings was Charles Whitfield, whose resignation from the executive committee had been announced that morning in a terse press release that made no mention of the discrimination case. After the formal press conference concluded, Wallace spoke privately with several civil rights leaders who attended to show support. The conversation quickly turned to the broader implications of the case. This settlement creates precedent, noted Reverend Marcus Johnson, a longtime activist. Other exclusive establishments will be watching closely, which is precisely why implementation matters so much, Wallace replied. The agreement includes specific benchmarks and verification processes to ensure the changes are genuine, not cosmetic. As they drove home afterward, Wallace noticed Eleanor studying her phone with concern. "What is it?" he asked. "Social media reaction," she replied. "Most is positive, but there's a troubling thread of backlash emerging. People defending the right of private establishments to choose their clientele, questioning why we didn't just go somewhere else that night." Wallace nodded grimly. "The same arguments have been recycled for generations, just with updated language. And some comments specifically target you," Eleanor continued, "suggesting you used your position as a former judge to bully a small business, calling it judicial activism, even in retirement." Wallace had expected this response. Throughout his career, efforts to expand equality have been met with claims of overreach and accusations that addressing discrimination somehow constituted special treatment. "Let them talk," he said finally. "History will judge who stood on the right side." The following day brought the first meeting of the implementation committee established under the settlement agreement. Wallace and Eleanor attended as observers, while Maya participated as their legal representative. The meeting took place at City Hall, in a conference room filled with community stakeholders, restaurant industry representatives, and civil rights advocates. The discussion focused on translating the settlement's requirements into concrete action steps. Architects presented refined plans for the physical renovation, diversity consultants outlined training protocols, and community representatives suggested candidates for the advisory board. Throughout the meeting, Wallace observed Thomas Crawford closely. The restaurant owner participated actively, demonstrating familiarity with the details and expressing genuine enthusiasm for certain aspects of the transformation. His engagement suggested something more than reluctant compliance or public relations management. He's either a very skilled actor or actually committed to this process, Wallace commented to Eleanor as they left the meeting. Perhaps both, Eleanor replied pragmatically. But either way, the oversight mechanisms we built into the agreement will ensure follow-through. That afternoon, they received a call from Justice Regina Washington with surprising news. The governor wants to expand the commission's mandate based on response to your case, she explained. There's momentum to address discrimination in private clubs and exclusive spaces statewide. The Cartwright Club case was already having ripple effects beyond what they had anticipated. Other establishments were proactively reviewing their policies, and lawmakers were discussing potential legislative reforms to strengthen public accommodation provisions. As Wallace and Eleanor prepared to host a small dinner for family to celebrate the settlement, the doorbell rang. Wallace opened it to find a young black woman he didn't recognize standing on their porch. Judge Ford. My name is Tanya Williams, she said, her voice slightly nervous. I used to work at the Cartwright Club as a host. I was there the night you and Mrs. Ford were asked to leave. Wallace invited her in, curious about her unexpected visit. I wanted to apologize for not speaking up that night, Tanya explained once seated in their living room. I saw what was happening and knew it was wrong, but I was afraid of losing my job. There's no need to apologize, Eleanor assured her gently. The responsibility lay with those in power, not with staff following directions. Tanya nodded. I quit the next day, though. Couldn't stomach being part of it anymore. She hesitated, then continued. But that's not really why I came. I'm in culinary school now, and I heard about the training program that's going to be established at the club. I want to be part of building something better in that space. Her visit represented something Wallace found deeply moving, the way struggle often created unexpected opportunities for growth and connection. This young woman had transformed her own pain and regret into determination to participate in positive change. Before Tanya left, Wallace asked what had prompted her to step forward now. Seeing you stand up like that, she replied simply. It reminded me that sometimes you have to choose between what's comfortable and what's right. Later that evening, as family gathered around their dining table, Maya raised a toast. To my grandparents, who never stopped fighting for justice, even on their anniversary night. Laughter and cheers followed, but Wallace felt a momentary pang of regret that their celebration dinner had become entangled with yet another battle against discrimination. Eleanor, sensing his thought, squeezed his hand under the table. We'll have that anniversary dinner yet, she whispered. Perhaps somewhere even better than the Cartwright Club. As the evening progressed, conversation naturally turned to the settlement and its implications. Maya's partner, a political consultant, reported that politicians across the spectrum were positioning themselves relative to the case, recognizing its resonance with voters. It's become a litmus test, he explained. Where you stand in a Cartwright Club case signals your broader positions on equality and inclusion. Wallace listened thoughtfully. Throughout his career, he had seen how individual cases sometimes became symbolic battlegrounds for larger social conflicts. The legal resolution, important as it was, represented just one dimension of impact. After dinner, as family members helped clear the table, Wallace stepped onto the back porch for a moment of quiet reflection. The night air was cool and still, stars visible despite the city lights. He thought about Tanya Williams and her courage in coming forward. About Thomas Crawford's apparent transformation from defender of exclusivity to advocate for change. About Charles Whitfield's bitter resistance to evolving social norms. Each represented different responses to the ongoing struggle for equality, adaptation, transformation, or entrenchment. The case had created a catalyst for all three, forcing people to confront their own positions and choices. Eleanor joined him on the porch, wrapping a light shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. Penny for your thoughts, she said, leaning against the railing beside him. I was thinking about ripple effects, Wallace replied. How actions continue to influence events long after the initial splash. Eleanor nodded. Like the young lawyers you mentored who now sit on benches themselves. Or the students I taught who are shaping constitutional interpretation for the next generation. Exactly. This case may be formally resolved, but its impact is just beginning. Their conversation was interrupted by Maya calling them back inside for dessert. As they turned to go, Wallace paused to look once more at the night sky. The work was never truly finished. Each victory created new possibilities. Each resolution gave way to new challenges. But standing there with Eleanor, surrounded by family who carried forward their values and commitment, Wallace felt a profound sense of continuity and purpose. They had spent 50 years fighting for justice together. The battlefield had changed, the tactics had evolved, but the essential struggle remained. And they remained in it, still standing side by side, still moving forward with dignity and determination. Whatever came next, implementation challenges, backlash, or unexpected opportunities, they would face it together as they always had. 6 months later, Wallace and Eleanor Ford stood outside the transformed entrance of what had once been the Cartwright Club. The building's facade had been renovated, replacing the heavy wooden doors with glass and light. A new sign read simply "The Cartwright," with a smaller inscription beneath, "Open to all." "Ready?" Wallace asked, offering Eleanor his arm. "Absolutely," she replied with a smile. Inside, the space was barely recognizable. Where once there had been separate dining areas divided by ornate partitions, now a unified restaurant space flowed naturally, filled with diverse patrons. The mahogany panels that had created exclusive alcoves had been repurposed into a stunning community table that ran the length of one wall. Thomas Crawford greeted them at the entrance. "Judge and Mrs. Ford, welcome. We've been looking forward to your visit." He guided them through the renovated space, pointing out the architectural and operational changes implemented under the settlement agreement. The former members-only lounge had been converted into a culinary education center, where aspiring chefs from underrepresented communities received training and mentorship. "Tanya Williams is one of our instructors now," Crawford noted, gesturing toward the teaching kitchen where Tanya was demonstrating techniques to a group of students. "She's exceptional, brought perspectives we desperately needed." The tour continued to a new exhibition space near the entrance, dedicated to documenting the restaurant's history, including its exclusionary past and recent transformation. Photographs, news articles, and timelines presented an unflinching account of both discrimination and change. "This was Maya's idea," Crawford explained. "She insisted we acknowledge our history, honestly rather than papering over it." Wallace studied the display with interest. Institutional memory matters. Without it, the same mistakes get repeated. They proceeded to a private dining room where a celebration had been arranged. To Wallace's surprise, the room was filled with familiar faces, former law clerks, Eleanor's students, civil rights colleagues, and family members. Maya stood at the center, beaming. "Happy anniversary," she announced as they entered. 6 months late, but worth the wait. Eleanor gasped softly. "You arranged all this?" "With Mr. Crawford's help," Maya confirmed. "We thought you deserved to finally have that anniversary dinner. You were denied." As they took their seats, Wallace noticed the diverse staff moving efficiently through the room, a stark contrast to his previous visit. The executive chef, a black woman who had trained at prestigious culinary institutes in France and Japan, came personally to describe the evening's menu. Throughout dinner, conversation flowed easily among the guests. Former adversaries now working together on the governor's commission shared insights with community advocates. Judges who had once clerked for Wallace discussed the case's legal implications with current law students studying Eleanor's textbooks. Midway through the meal, Crawford stood to offer a toast. 6 months ago, I thought the lawsuit would destroy everything I had built, he admitted candidly. Instead, it created an opportunity to build something better. He raised his glass. To Judge and Mrs. Ford, whose dignity in the face of injustice inspired transformation rather than mere retribution. The room applauded warmly. Wallace acknowledged the toast with a nod, struck by the journey that had brought them all to this moment. After dinner, as guests mingled over dessert, Wallace found himself speaking with one of the community advisory board members, a longtime civil rights activist named Gloria Richardson. "The changes here are impressive," Gloria commented, "but I'm more interested in the ripple effects. 3 other exclusive establishments in the city have proactively reformed their policies since your case settled. The Commission's work has accelerated that process," Wallace noted. "Eleanor's draft legislation on public accommodation standards is gaining bipartisan support." Gloria smiled. "You two never stop, do you?" "The work continues," Wallace replied simply. Across the room, Eleanor was deep in conversation with a group of young attorneys who had volunteered their services during the case. Wallace watched her with admiration, still moved by her passion and intelligence after 50 years of partnership. Later, as the celebration began to wind down, Crawford approached Wallace privately. "There's something I wanted to show you before you leave," he said, leading Wallace toward his office. On Crawford's desk lay a letter on expensive stationery. "This arrived yesterday from Charles Whitfield," Crawford explained. "He's selling his shares in the restaurant group and withdrawing completely from any association with us." Wallace scanned the letter, noting Whitfield's thinly veiled disdain for the regrettable direction of the establishment under Crawford's leadership. "Some people cannot adapt to change," Wallace observed, handing back the letter. Crawford nodded. "Whitfield represents the past. But I've learned something important through this process. Defending the indefensible costs more than changing, both financially and morally." When Wallace rejoined the party, he found Eleanor waiting for him near the new community table. The evening was concluding, guests gradually departing with warm embraces and promises to continue various collaborative projects. "What did Crawford want to show you?" Eleanor asked. Wallace explained about Whitfield's letter as they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. "Not surprising," Eleanor commented. "Men like Whitfield rarely change their fundamental beliefs. They simply find new spaces to express them." "True," Wallace agreed. "But their influence diminishes with each institution that chooses a different path." Outside, the evening air was warm and pleasant. Maya approached to confirm their ride was waiting, but suggested they might want to see one last feature of the renovation. She led them to a small garden that had been created where a private parking area once stood. At its center stood a simple bronze plaque embedded in stone. Wallace leaned closer to read the inscription. "Dedicated to Judge Wallace Ford and Professor Eleanor Ford, whose courage inspired this space of welcome and equity. May their example remind us that justice requires both accountability and transformation." Emotion welled unexpectedly in Wallace's throat. Throughout his career, he had never sought recognition, focusing instead on the substance of his work and its impact. To see their names memorialized not for their professional accomplishments, but for a personal stand against discrimination felt profoundly meaningful. "Maya, did you know about this?" Eleanor asked, her own voice thick with feeling. "It was Crawford's idea," Maya replied. "He insisted it be placed where everyone entering would see it." As they finally prepared to depart, Wallace took one last look at the transformed Cartwright. The building stood as concrete evidence that change was possible, that institutions built on exclusion could be reimagined and repurposed to serve broader communities. In the car heading home, Eleanor rested her head on Wallace's shoulder. "Not quite the anniversary celebration we originally planned," she remarked with gentle humor. "No," Wallace agreed. "It was much more meaningful." He thought about the path that had brought them here, from being turned away at the door to inspiring institutional transformation, about how their lifetime of work had prepared them to respond to that moment of injustice not with rage or resignation, but with strategic purpose and principled determination. The next morning, Wallace woke early and went to his study. On his desk lay an accumulation of papers related to both the lawsuit and the governor's commission, draft policies, proposed legislation, implementation reports. The work continued, as it always had. Eleanor joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I spoke with Maya last night after we got home," she said. "The advisory board is considering expanding the culinary program to include hospitality management training. They want us both to speak at the launch." Wallace accepted the coffee with a smile. Another opportunity to shape the future. They sat together in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee and watching the morning sun illuminate their garden. After a few moments, Eleanor spoke again. "Do you remember what you said to me the day we got married?" she asked. "About why you wanted to pursue a legal career instead of direct activism?" Wallace nodded. "I said changing laws and institutions might be less visible than protests, but could create more lasting transformation. And I said the real victory wouldn't be what we accomplished, but what we enabled others to build after us," Eleanor added. They both looked at the papers spread across Wallace's desk, evidence of both battles won and work still unfolding. Their individual lawsuit had expanded into legislative proposals, policy reforms, and institutional changes that would outlast any single legal victory. 50 years later, Wallace reflected, and we're still having the same conversation, but not fighting the same battles, Eleanor corrected gently. The terrain has shifted. The challenges have evolved. And so have the possibilities. Wallace took her hand, thinking of the plaque in the Cartwright's garden and the diverse faces gathered at last night's celebration. Of Tanya Williams teaching culinary arts where she had once been silenced. Of Thomas Crawford transforming his business model rather than defending discrimination. Change never came easily or completely. The same prejudices that had led to their exclusion still existed, sometimes openly, sometimes disguised as tradition or standards. But institutions that had once embodied those prejudices could be transformed. People who had once enforced exclusion could choose different paths. This had been the core belief that sustained their 50 years of partnership, that justice was not just a destination but a continuous process of growth and transformation. That dignity demanded not just recognition but lasting structural change. As they finished their coffee and prepared to begin another day of purposeful work, Wallace felt a deep sense of contentment. Not because all battles had been won, but because they had stayed in the struggle together, their commitment to justice undiminished by time or challenge. What had begun as a simple anniversary dinner denied had evolved into something far more significant, another chapter in their lifelong commitment to creating a more just and equitable world, not just for themselves but for generations to come. The truth is, dignity has a way of outlasting shame. Rules can be rewritten. Places can change. But in the end, what really matters is how we carry ourselves when no one expects us to. Like Wallace and Eleanor, holding steady, together, unshaken. That's the end of the story. Do you think the manager deserved a second chance after everything? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your take. Thanks for watching, and if this moved you, share it with a friend. Don't forget to subscribe and click over to the next story. We've got more coming.